Welcome back. It was 2 years ago that a man sent 16 packages containing pipe bombs to Democrats and other perceived Trump opponents. In October, the FBI arrested 13 people in a connection with a plot to kidnap Michigan's Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer. Virginia's governor was also on the kidnapping list. And throughout the Trump presidency, journalists have been routinely threatened by Trump supporters. Sadly, I can attest to that on a near weekly basis. In the wake of Wednesday's events, it's fair to ask why so many people remain silent about the obvious threat President Trump's incendiary rhetoric posed. So joining me now is Republican Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. Senator Toomey, thank you for joining us. It's been a rough week. Welcome back to Meet the Press. Yeah. Let me start with this. There's calls for resignation, impeachment, removal by way of the 25th Amendment. You yourself said he's committed impeachable offenses. In your view, what is the most appropriate way for Donald Trump to exit office?
What's good, people? Jack Mockler is back again. So this is happening right now. On the morning after the Capitol was breached, Washington faced a nightmare made real. 5 lives lost, hundreds of police injured, and the sacred certification ritual shattered. The calls that followed cut through all political posturing, demanding accountability in a way the Capitol had never seen before. The calls were coming from everywhere. Democrats who had spent years warning about the dangers of Trump's rhetoric were now joined by voices they never expected to hear. Republican senators who had defended Trump through scandal after scandal, who had tolerated his most outrageous statements, who had looked the other way when norms were shattered and boundaries were crossed, were now reaching the same conclusion. A line had been crossed. A boundary had been breached that could not be uncrossed. And the message they were delivering was stark, unambiguous, and utterly extraordinary.
Well, I think the best way for our country, Chuck, is for the president to resign and go away as soon as possible. I acknowledge that may not be likely, but I think that would be best. It does not look as though there is the will or the consensus to exercise the 25th Amendment option. And I don't think there's time to do an impeachment. There's 10 days left before the president leaves anyway. I think the best thing would be a resignation.
The issue of impeachment. You have said he committed impeachable offenses, and there's clearly the timing issue. But one of the goals, one of the penalties that come with impeachment, this is almost as much about removing him from current office, but it would prevent him from ever holding federal office again, assuming a majority Senate vote, if he's convicted, would also then do that. Should that be the goal? How to make sure this man never holds federal office ever again in that because of what he did on Wednesday?
Yeah, so Chuck, a couple of things. One,
he needs to go, not in a few months, not after the next election, now, before January 20th, before he has 2 more weeks to do God knows what in the Oval Office. Resign, leave, get out. These were not the words of political opponents. These were the words of senators who had sat in the same party meetings, who had voted for Trump's agenda, who had defended his policies on the floor of the Senate. And now they were saying what no one expected to hear from Republicans. The President of the United States must step down immediately. That story, the story of what happened in those days after the Capitol attack, is the story we are telling today. Not just the extraordinary calls for resignation, though those calls deserve to be examined in all their historical significance, but what happened when those calls came, how Trump responded.
It's not clear. The Constitution permits impeachment, conviction, and prohibition against ever serving again, which is a separate vote. That's permitted after a person has left office, which is what would have to happen here. So whether that could be done in a binding fashion is really an open question. So that's number one. Number two, I would certainly hope, and I actually do believe, that the president has disqualified himself. I don't think he's a viable candidate for office ever again because of the outrageous behavior in the post-election period. So those would be my 2 points.
Throughout his term, Senator, you were on here quite a few times when uncomfortably he would say something or do something where I would ask you about his rhetoric, and you had a consistent answer. And I want to show some folks those answers. Here we go.
I don't spend a lot of time trying to evaluate and analyze why the president comes to the conclusions he comes to. I don't spend a lot of time focusing on the president's tweets and things that the president says. What I focus more on is what is he going to actually do. I think it's a long way to attributing any kind of real link.
What he did when senators from his own party publicly demanded his departure, and most importantly, what the entire episode reveals about the true limits of institutional resistance to a president who has made a career out of refusing accountability. Because the lesson of those days, the lesson of how Trump survived the most serious accountability crisis any American president has faced, is perhaps the most important political lesson of the entire Trump era. And it is more relevant right now than it has ever been. The dynamics that played out in those tense days after January 6th established a template that has defined Trump's approach to every subsequent challenge. A template that is currently being tested again in the context of his second term. In the immediate aftermath, the shock of what had happened was still reverberating through every corridor of power in Washington.
Between what the president might say or tweet and the extraordinary type of madness that leads someone to massacre people.
Now, look, in fairness, I also want to play what you said on the Senate floor this week. Here's that.
We witness today the damage that can result when men in power and responsibility refuse to acknowledge the truth. We saw bloodshed because the demagogue chose to spread falsehoods and sow distrust of his own fellow Americans.
Senator, you know the question that's coming, and I'm sure you've heard it from a lot of people. Do you regret not speaking out sooner? And did you underestimate the threat of his rhetoric?
Chuck, I think it's important to make a distinction between the president's behavior prior to the election and his behavior after the election. For years, and said ridiculous things. He lied frequently, many objectionable things. If they were sufficiently objectionable, I did publicly weigh in, and I did many, many times. But he tweeted hundreds of times a day, many days. And I still don't think that I should have gone back and attempted to be his Twitter editor.
The Capitol police officer who had been injured in the clash with the mob died from his injuries, adding another name to the list of lives lost in the attack on American democracy. Flags were lowered to half-staff. Officers gathered at the Capitol to pay tribute to their fallen colleague, flashing their emergency lights in a solemn display of respect that moved even hardened political observers. The police chief resigned. The Senate sergeant-at-arms stepped down. Heads were rolling in the security establishment as questions mounted about how such a catastrophic failure of protection could have occurred. The National Guard had not been deployed in time. The intelligence had been there. The warnings had been issued. And yet the Capitol had been overrun. Against this backdrop of institutional crisis and political chaos, the calls for Trump's resignation began to crystallize into something more concrete. This was not a fringe movement. This was not the fevered dream of left-wing activists. This was the mainstream of American political leadership confronting what they had witnessed and reaching an unmistakable conclusion. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer issued a joint statement that cut through the usual diplomatic language of political statements. They called on Vice President Mike Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office. Not as a suggestion, not as a long-term recommendation, but as an immediate demand with a concrete deadline. They made it clear that if Pence did not act, the House would move to impeach Trump as quickly as the legislative calendar would allow. The 25th Amendment demand was specifically designed to create urgency. It could be invoked quickly if the Vice President and a majority of the cabinet agreed. Impeachment would take longer, requiring a House vote and then a Senate trial. Democrats were trying to create the fastest possible removal pathway by first pressuring Pence to take the 25th Amendment route. But what made the days after January 6th so genuinely extraordinary, what historians will point to as the most significant moment of bipartisan accountability pressure in modern American history, was that it was not only Democrats who were calling for Trump's departure. Two Republican senators, members of his own party, people who had spent years either supporting his agenda or staying silent about his excesses, broke publicly and explicitly. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska told a newspaper that Trump simply needed to get out. In those specific words, a Republican senator saying the president of her own party needed to get out, and she did not stop there. She went further, publicly questioning whether she could even remain in the Republican Party if it continued to align itself with Trump after what had happened on January 6th. This was not a careful, hedged political statement designed to maximize flexibility and minimize risk. This was a senator expressing fundamental doubt about her own political identity in the face of what she had witnessed. Then Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania joined her. He said Trump should resign and go away as soon as possible. He made the case that resignation was the best path forward, and he made that case publicly, on the record, knowing exactly what the political consequences might be. He said it because he was right that there was not enough time for a full impeachment trial before January 20th, and in the absence of a viable removal mechanism, voluntary resignation was the most direct way for Trump to leave office before his term expired. 2 Republican senators, in public, on the record, calling for the president of their own party to resign after a violent attack on the building where they worked, after 5 people had died, after hundreds of police officers had been injured defending the institution that houses the legislative branch they were part of. The significance of this cannot be overstated. In an era of extreme partisan polarization, where loyalty to party had become the primary currency of political survival, these 2 senators were putting principle above party. They were risking their political futures to say what they believed needed to be said, and their statements sent shockwaves through Washington that reached all the way to the White House. But the external political pressure from senators and Democratic leadership was matched by something equally remarkable happening inside the White House itself. An internal crisis was unfolding that most Americans never fully understood in real time. Senior White House officials were resigning. Not quietly, not with the kind of discreet departures that happen when people leave positions for personal reasons or new opportunities. They were resigning publicly with statements that made clear exactly why they were leaving. A wave of departures swept through the administration. Senior figures from Trump's cabinet, from his inner circle, from his communications team, all walked out the door in the immediate aftermath of January 6th. These were people who had worked for Trump, who had defended him through multiple controversies, who had developed careers in and around his administration. They were not fair-weather supporters. They were people who had been in the trenches with him. And they were leaving in a way that communicated something unmistakable to everyone watching. This is too much. This is the line. I cannot continue to be associated with this. I cannot defend what happened. I cannot be part of an administration that has presided over an attack on the democratic institutions we are sworn to protect. The wave of resignations from officials was itself a profound accountability statement. Not the formal accountability of impeachment or removal, but a documented public statement by people with direct insider knowledge that what had happened on January 6th represented something they could not defend or continue to support. They were walking away from the Trump administration at its moment of greatest crisis, and their departures spoke volumes about the atmosphere inside the White House during those desperate days. And then there were the discussions happening at the highest levels of the administration. Reports emerged in the days after January 6th that some cabinet members were quietly discussing the 25th Amendment. Not publicly, not on the record, but in private conversations among themselves about whether the constitutional provision that allows the vice president and cabinet to declare the president unable to discharge his duties was an option that deserved serious consideration. These were Trump's own appointees, people he had personally selected to serve in his administration. And they were discussing among themselves whether to invoke the constitutional mechanism for removing him from office. According to reporting from multiple outlets, those discussions did not produce a formal cabinet move. They did not produce the kind of organized cabinet action the 25th Amendment requires. They remained private conversations that ultimately went nowhere. But their existence, the mere fact that Trump's own cabinet members were discussing among themselves whether to invoke the constitutional mechanism for removing him, tells you something absolutely crucial about how people with direct personal knowledge of Trump's conduct in the aftermath of January 6th were assessing his fitness to continue in office. They were deeply concerned. They were considering extraordinary measures, and even though they ultimately did not act, those discussions represented a level of concern that was unprecedented in modern American history. Mike Pence's specific role in this period was central and deeply complicated. Pence was the person who had refused to go along with the scheme to reject certified electoral votes on January 6th itself. He had performed his constitutional duty despite enormous pressure from Trump and from some members of Congress to do otherwise. Rioters in the Capitol that day had been chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." He had been rushed to a secure location as the Capitol was breached. And then, in the aftermath, he was the specific person that Democratic leaders were calling on to invoke the 25th Amendment. He had the constitutional authority to do it if the cabinet went along. He had been directly and personally endangered by the riot that Trump was being held responsible for inciting. He had more personal reasons than almost anyone to take action. And he declined. He concluded, through his own legal and political calculation, that invoking the 25th Amendment was not the appropriate response. His reasoning, according to reporting, was that the 25th Amendment was designed for cases of physical or mental incapacity, situations where a president was literally unable to perform the functions of the office, not for cases of deliberate misconduct. This is a defensible constitutional interpretation, one that legal scholars have debated extensively. But the practical effect of Pence's decision was that the single most important actor in the 25th Amendment scenario, the vice president without whom the mechanism could not be initiated, declined to act. And that decision meant that the most immediate removal pathway closed before it could be seriously pursued. So what did Trump actually do during these desperate days? His response to the pressure, the calls for resignation, the Republican senators speaking out, the cabinet discussions, the wave of official departures, was revealing both in what it consisted of and what it did not consist of. He did not acknowledge responsibility. He did not reach out to Republican senators who had broken with him to understand their concerns. He did not engage with the resignation demands as a political leader facing a legitimate accountability crisis. What he did was release a scripted video, a carefully produced statement in which he condemned the violence, urged his supporters to remain peaceful, and spoke in terms designed to create enough distance from what had happened at the Capitol to make the most extreme accountability responses less politically viable. The video was not an admission. It was not an apology. It was a political instrument designed to reduce the temperature enough that the impeachment momentum would lose some of its urgency, and that the resignation calls would not generate enough bipartisan momentum to produce an actual outcome. And then he focused on the clock. 14 days. He just had to get through 14 days. Keep enough Republicans from breaking with him to prevent a Senate conviction after impeachment. Keep enough institutional support to prevent the 25th Amendment from being invoked. And survive until January 20th, when Biden would be inaugurated and Trump would leave office, having served out his term, having never been removed, and having never resigned. That strategy worked. The House impeached him on a bipartisan vote that included more than a dozen Republican members. It was the most bipartisan presidential impeachment in American history. But the Senate trial came after Biden's inauguration, after Trump was no longer in office, and it ended in an acquittal. 57 senators voted to convict, 7 of them Republicans. But the two-thirds threshold was not reached. Trump survived. He left office not because the accountability mechanisms worked, but because his term expired. The political cost that Murkowski and Toomey paid, or in Toomey's case avoided by retirement, tells us something crucial about the incentive structure for Republican officials facing accountability decisions about Trump. Toomey could speak freely because he had already decided not to seek re-election. His political future was not dependent on Trump's continued goodwill. Murkowski could speak and face the primary challenge because Alaska's political culture and its ranked choice voting system gave her a path to survival that most Republican senators in Trump-aligned states would not have had. The senators who did not join them, who stayed silent or voted to acquit in the impeachment trial, made political calculations that their survival required alignment with Trump rather than accountability for him. Those calculations were, in most cases, probably correct about the immediate political reality. Most Republican senators who had voted to convict or spoken out in favor of resignation would have faced serious primary challenges in Trump-aligned states. That is not a hypothetical. It is exactly what happened to the Republicans who did vote to convict. Primary challenges, fundraising disadvantages, political marginalization. The incentive structure facing Republican officials on accountability questions is one where the cost of breaking with Trump is immediate, concrete, and politically severe, while the benefit of serving some abstract principle of constitutional accountability is diffuse and distant. Most politicians respond to immediate, concrete incentives rather than to diffuse, abstract ones. And that rational calculation is one of the primary reasons the January 6th accountability mechanisms failed to produce removal. The survival strategy that Trump employed, running out the clock until the accountability mechanisms exhausted themselves, established a template that has defined his approach to every subsequent accountability challenge. The lesson of the post-January 6th period is that if you can keep enough institutional support, refuse to engage with accountability demands, and simply wait for time to run out or for the political moment to pass, you can survive almost any crisis. That lesson has been applied consistently. The clock-running strategy does not resolve the underlying accountability questions, but it prevents those questions from producing removal or resignation, and that has been sufficient. The failure of the 25th Amendment threat and the impeachment conviction to reach the required thresholds reveals the structural limits of constitutional removal mechanisms when partisan loyalty remains strong enough. The mechanisms exist. They were invoked or nearly invoked, but they could not produce removal because the structural requirements assume levels of bipartisan consensus and institutional independence that were not present in sufficient measure. That structural reality, that removal mechanisms designed for severe cases require levels of political agreement that extreme partisan polarization makes nearly impossible to achieve, is the most important institutional lesson of the January 6th accountability period. The question the post-January 6th episode raises about what it would actually take to force removal is the most important question for understanding the current moment. If bipartisan calls for resignation, a House impeachment with Republican votes, a Senate conviction vote with 7 Republican senators voting to convict, a wave of official departures, cabinet discussions of the 25th Amendment, and public statements from senators calling for Trump to get out were not sufficient to produce removal, what would be sufficient? That is the question the January 6th accountability period forces us to ask. And the honest answer is that no one fully knows. The constitutional mechanisms require levels of political agreement that extreme polarization makes almost impossible to achieve. Voluntary resignation requires a willingness to acknowledge responsibility that Trump has never demonstrated. An election, the mechanism that ultimately removed him from office in 2020 and that returned him to it, is the only accountability mechanism that has definitively worked. The events of January 6th represented one of the most direct and most visible tests of American democratic resilience in the country's modern history. A violent attack on the legislative branch, deaths, injuries to hundreds of police officers, the disruption of the constitutional process for certifying the results of a presidential election, and in the immediate aftermath, genuine bipartisan alarm, genuine calls for accountability from both parties, genuine discussions within the executive branch about the constitutional mechanisms for removal. All of that happened. And then, through a combination of partisan loyalty, structural limitations of constitutional removal mechanisms, and Trump's clock-running strategy, no removal occurred. The accountability mechanisms were tested and found to be insufficient, not because they were wrong in design, not because the situation was not serious enough to warrant them, but because the political conditions, the partisan polarization, the loyalty of enough Republicans, the unwillingness of Pence to act, made the mechanisms unworkable in practice, even when they were theoretically available. That gap between the theoretical availability of accountability mechanisms and their practical workability in conditions of extreme partisan polarization is the most important lesson of the January 6th aftermath. The survival of Trump's first term, the failure of the accountability mechanisms despite bipartisan pressure, despite impeachment, despite resignation calls, set the conditions for his return to the presidency. His second term is now producing its own set of accountability challenges: the constitutional confrontations with courts, the foreign policy crises, the domestic political battles, and the lesson of January 6th that Trump can outlast almost any institutional pressure as long as he maintains enough Republican cover and the clock is running in his direction is the lesson that shapes every accountability calculation in the current moment. The question hanging over the second term is whether the conditions will ever change enough to make the outcome different. Whether the accumulated weight of crises will eventually produce the kind of political breaking point that January 6th did not quite reach. The answer to that question is genuinely uncertain. But understanding January 6th, understanding how close the system came to removal and why it ultimately fell short, is essential to evaluating what it would take for the outcome to be different. And that understanding starts here with the senators who called for resignation and the president who walked away from those calls without consequence, leaving behind a constitutional system that had been tested to its limits and found to be insufficient.